There it goes. Bam.
This is Fred Burton, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
Man, thanks for coming on. I appreciate it. It's the holiday season, and I know, like, I'm already feeling the pressure. Like, I got to clean the house. I got to do some work that I got to get back to. But I love talking to guys like us who've done stuff in that intel world, trying to make the world a better place. One thing I get trapped in, man, when I think about our work is, we tend to, as we get older, see more and more threat in more and more places. Is that a fair reality to live in, or are we too threat focused?
Well, Pete, first, thanks for having me on. I think that when you look at this from the standpoint of just the overwhelming social media feeds, I think it's easy to be inundated with the current threat landscape that we're in. But, as a nation, we certainly have been here before. If you go back to look, the time period between 1968 and 1972, it was actually a much more violent society during that time period, most notably with the assassinations of Robert F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King, combined with just the domestic bombings that occurred that were mostly driven by anti-war protests.
Yeah. You look at the chain of people who either died from murder, bombs, etc., but also the drug overdosing that was happening back then. And not that we don't have similar problems today, but we had a different outlook on drugs. Things that were prescribed, could kill you, and you didn't realize it because you didn't realize you were getting addicted, and so we had a problem with that. Is part of it that we feel like we should be in a better place, but we see these very similar problems today, do you think?
I think from a domestic terrorism perspective, these events are very cyclical, meaning,
Okay.
The fascinating thing to me as a student of violence and the student of protection history is that if you look in that 68 to 72 window of time, there was actually approximately 2,500 domestic bombings inside the United States, which included the U.S. Capitol, the Pentagon, and literally inside the State Department, outside my old office, where an improvised explosive device took down 3 floors. And as you look at that in context, we don't have anywhere near that scope of the domestic violence. But obviously, you look at the attempts on the life of President Trump, and certainly the horrific assassination of Charlie Kirk. We've kind of gone back to that sniper threat, which is just simply frightening from a protection standpoint.
Yeah, and it's easy to look post-event and say, Butler, why, blah, 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 whatever. But you and I both know, just coordinating comms between all these different agencies and elements, if there's anything that degrades the overall security, that when you show up, okay, that's one thing, not enough agents on site. Oh my God, this crowd's 200,000 people more than we all these other things. But if you can't talk to one another, oh my God, like it becomes crazy.
Yeah, it certainly is, as you and I both know, especially with multiple jurisdictions. And, I've been in this business since 1981, and you would like to think that in our post 9/11 world, which is a lifetime ago for many people and many of your viewers today, that we would have had something as simple as common, operating platform when it came to just law enforcement communications amongst the state, local, and federal. It exists in sporadic locations and various task force and so forth, but it's certainly not a streamlined process, or it's not as good as it needs to be.
Yeah. The in '96 I was in Bosnia, and one of our taskings was to be the next element in line as the FLOTUS, First Lady Hillary Clinton, bounced around the battlefield. And so we'd have our little, radio, and we'd listen and talk and everything. And I was told that if anything happens, my job was to drive up as fast as possible up to the First Lady, and her and only her needed to get into my Humvee. I had a 2-seater, and then take her off to somewhere else, and then details to follow. Fred, there's no way I'm racing up to the First Lady based upon what I was told, right? Because I would have been in total confusion. Because you're trying to hear the radio and you can't really hear it. I got my Humvee running. I'm told that there's Delta Force guys in the hills, looking at sniping positions and everything. And I'm like, you want me to race up to the first lady. There's nothing to identify me. I'm in a green Humvee, you know. Okay, granted, it's a high boy. You're like, okay, you can see that, but there's zero chance I wasn't get shot in that case. And so I would have gotten there, but I would not have raced up because, and that's, we've all got the same radio system. We all have the same encryption. And still I was like, there's zero chance that I'm doing that because I don't trust that entire system. So again, I'm just creating this fog that happens, you know, because the guys over at headquarters 5 miles away, when we're not all talking at the same time.
No, you're absolutely right. You know, having worked at not only the State Department but in the Secret Service, you know, you practice attack on your principles, and you go through various scenarios. But you know, it's very self-contained kind of cover and evacuate. You know, body cover, move the principal to a secure vehicle or to a safe house, safe haven, whatever you can do from that standpoint. But you know, a lot of the problems, you know, boil down to just basic logistics and advanced work and good advanced work. And obviously it takes very good protective intelligence work. You know, the challenge today is there's so many different threat streams, predominantly on social media for the most part, is trying to make sure that you have enough technology or tools in place to be able to capture those adverse intelligence signals that are coming in order to database that person of interest and then do proper follow-up investigation to try to figure out who it is. But you and I both know it's so difficult today, especially with some of these, you know, X feeds and so forth. Just trying to identify where is that threat coming from.
And you know, you're trying to chase down every lead, but it becomes overwhelming, especially when leads can be generated by sock puppet accounts and false flag, you know, all kinds of noise can be inserted into the machine. And I'm laughing because every time you're on a security detail, you're like, but we were assigned 25 people and we have 8. Like when this happens, that's a norm to not fully man up. So you have all this information now with social media that makes it confusing and never full staffing. Never, ever.
Yeah, and especially during campaign years, which are the worst, you know, at least for the U.S. Secret Service and, you know, for the State Department, the Diplomatic Security Service, you know, the challenge has always been just the endless travel. I mean, if you look at, you know, for example, how much Rubio's moving around as Secretary of State now. You know, it's you're always on protection. You're always somewhere else. And then let's not forget, you know, a few years back, I wrote a book on Benghazi, and you start looking back at just your high threat posts around the world. And that's what a lot of people, especially inside the United States, fail to recognize, that, you know, any given day, the State Department, you know, is managing, you know, threats against a range of different U.S. embassies and consulates and diplomatic personnel. And you have critical threat posts around the globe, and just staffing them accordingly and properly in itself is just a manpower nightmare. And, you know, quite frankly, it's always been this way with, you know, my old outfit. You never really have enough resources to get the job. And then when something happens, obviously Congress then allocates more resources. And then, you know, there's a constant boom or bust phenomenon going in, not only within the State Department, but the same with the Secret Service, as we saw with, you know, the aftermath of Butler and the attempt on President Trump's life in West Palm.
Yeah. Some of this is the system, right? I mean, the sergeant major doesn't say, you got what you got for no reason. It's like, this is what you get. Now go do the job. And for the most part, and way more than 99 times out of 100, like 99 point, like a blog number of 9s, no problem. I mean, it doesn't make a big impact. And so you have to cut somewhere. Why wouldn't you cut on the man side? Because it's just, the chances are it's not going to happen. And when it does, boy, oh boy, you make the news.
Yeah, you know, there's a zero fail component when it comes to protection. And, you know, I don't care who you're protecting, whether in the public or the private sector. You know, as we saw with the political assassination of the United Healthcare CEO. Right. And then conversely, you look at, you know, the horrific murder of Charlie Kirk. And so, the business is one that's always fraught with peril. Trying to understanding your threat landscape on any given day is extraordinarily difficult to do. It takes dedicated, a protective intelligence kind of approach to events. You have to be able to monitor threat streams literally 24/7 in a live kind of capacity. And it's challenging. It's challenging today. And it's a much more complex threat landscape than it ever has been, predominantly due to the fact of just the endless social media and 24/7 news cycle.
Yeah, instant news cycle, really. I mean, it's so fast now. I'm putting links up for Fred's books. There's Beirut Rules. There's the Amazon link. These are all going to be in the remarks section on YouTube and Facebook. Here, by the way, is his protective service website. So, by the way, and Ken is here. Ken, welcome to the show. Thanks for hanging out with me. I appreciate it as always.
Good morning. Sorry, it's a few minutes late. As I told you, we had a hurricane force windstorm come through a couple of days ago, and had to take the truck down after a tree got blown on top of it to get it estimate to whether or not my new truck can get repaired. So, been listening to you guys. Glad to join you. Good to meet you, Fred, and great topic today.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Ken.
we were talking about the security aspect of all this stuff, Ken, that we do, and the amount of noise, but also our passion for all things security. So let me just go further on that. So Fred, I was in Iraq. We were being hunted, and people were being hit by a sniper that came after our battalion. And so all of a sudden, we're all doing lazy W's and slowing down the pace of operations and thinking about every high point, every window, what assets are going to be on site. And that's what you have to do for counter sniper operations. It is exhausting. I mean, the amount of resources you're tasking air to come into your area, helicopters, air assets, everybody. And so there's just a lot of attention on that sniper threat. If it's contained in that battalion area, that guy's going to move around. And so it is, people don't realize how resource intensive it is. Yes, there should be people looking at every rooftop. But again, if you got those 8 dudes, and this is the next thing I was going to say is the exhausting part is also day to day. Like counterintelligence Pete deployed. Well, I've got 4 hours of pre-mission prep to do. I'm writing reports, and I got to do the mission. It's exhausting physically because you're out 6 hours, 10 hours, 12 hours, however long on a patrol, and you still got to eat, and then you still got to do your report writing. And quite often, 36-hour days is what the workload is, and so we lose sight of that. I guess so. Talk about that part of the manning too, just the pace of work each day and how much that equals, especially if you're in a leader position where you have multiple things to be responsible for.
Yeah, it's an extraordinarily difficult logistical challenge. You could go back again as a student of protective history, and I've spoken a lot on this topic and certainly written about it and lived it in many ways. You go back to the Warren Commission, and one of their recommendations, came out of that was that the Secret Service needed a counter sniper capacity. And that's when the Secret Service stood up their counter sniper team. But you think in that in context, and you fast forward a few years after the JFK's assassination, and I've interviewed agents that were on the Lancer detail, which was the Kennedy detail during that time period, and none of them ever anticipated or thought that a sniper would be anywhere, whether it be in the tower or on the grassy knoll, however you want to believe how many shooters may have been there. And then you fast forward a few years later, and you have the assassination of Martin Luther King by James Earl Ray, another sniper. And then that problem should have been fixed, right? But then you look in just in context, and you fast forward to the attempt on President Trump's life in Butler predominantly, which was very close to, killing a presidential candidate at the time. And then obviously the counter surveillance operation in West Palm identified the shooter lying in wait there. So that sniper threat is one that has haunted protectors in modern history forever. And it just goes to show you how the acts of a lone gunman can certainly change the course of history.
That sniper threat that you talk about, and I don't know how much study you've had a chance to look at Butler yet, but I'm still real confused and don't feel that the public has has really gotten the full answer on what happened at Butler. And as a professional that's been in this business also for well over 30 years, if you can see it, you can shoot it. Well, they shot him, so that means they could see him. Where was the breakdown there? Have you had a chance to look at that? And if you have any thoughts or opinions on what the breakdown was? Because obviously they could see him.
Yeah, no, you raise a very good point, Ken, and I've written about it. I've done interviews on that, shortly after the attack and so forth. And look, campaign years are tough with the Secret Service resource-wise. There's no doubt that former President Trump at the time needed, because of the threat profile, the same level of protection that PPD had, the Presidential Protection Division for President Biden, but there was not, for whatever reason. Manpower, resources, politics, pick your bucket to choose from. And the counter sniper team from the Secret Service was deployed there. It's my understanding we're at least one team short because they didn't have the PPD assignment for an additional counter sniper team there. And having said all that, it's still the responsibility of the Secret Service advance agent at the time to pre-post certain spots that he or she feel are vulnerabilities. And so that rooftop obviously needed to be pre-posted by somebody. And then again, you get the finger pointing there, where the Fed said that they asked the locals to do it, and the locals said this was a Fed responsibility. At the end of the day, it is a federal responsibility. They should have had that roof pre-posted. And so when you look at that from just a protective intelligence perspective, there was an advance agent dedicated to intelligence. To the best of my knowledge, I've seen no reports that that individual was known or of record to the Secret Service, and perhaps the shooter was buried in some other database of some sort. But again, it's in many ways it reminds me of the Secret Service trip to Dallas with President Kennedy, when Oswald was known to U.S. naval intelligence and known to the FBI and known to the CIA, and yet that was not passed to the Secret Service advance agent at the time. But again, that was a very analog world, and everything was on 3x5 index cards and so forth during that time period. So, these kinds of failures occur. Most of them are human error. Most of them are a breakdown in logistics. But at the end of the day, I would like to think that the Secret Service has corrected that problem going forward to eliminate that threat. I know for a fact that it has drastically impacted, high-profile private sector details here in the United States, because I know many of the teams that are out running around now, and they're pulling their Gulfstream into a hangar now and disembarking their VIP out of that. They're putting a prohibition on speaking in outside events and venues and so forth, and moving everybody on the inside, to kind of counter that threat. I'm optimistic that will work for at least for a while, but it's like anything else in the protection business. When you have a zero-fail mission, if you have somebody hell-bent on carrying out an attack, unless you have that person in a database and you have that person under surveillance 24/7, it's hard to keep tabs on all the potential threat actors that are out there roaming around.
What does it look like when you pick up someone who is like, punch Donald Trump in the face? They have no intent. They don't plan to do anything, but they get swept up into that, in that database. Hey, these are people that are, openly talking about violence towards a person. We use Donald Trump because you hear this every day, every single day on social media. You could hear it in coffee circles, that kind of thing. How do you sort that out from people who have the right to express their political point of view and can say violent things and be like, yeah, well, that's the rules here?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's not easy. I ran our protective intelligence division at the State Department and was part of the original team that put it together. And the easiest way to get database forever, at least back in the day, was to make a threat or to reach a threshold that was either a written threat, in those days, threat letters, or someone that walked in that claimed that they had information about an individual that's planning some sort of an act of terror or harbored some ill will. And then, the Secret Service and the State Department pretty good vetting programs today with doing some behavioral analysis on those individuals and looking at individuals from a threat assessment perspective. And if you have a threat actor that's in proximity to your protectee, regardless of where they may be, you would physically surveil those individuals. So, for example, back on my watch, we protected Princess Diana a lot, and Prince Charles, now the King of England, the kids and so forth, and the likes of like Yasser Arafat and others, and a lot of the Israeli protectees like Rabin and Perez and so forth. And if you had threat actors that you thought were a serious threat, a lot of it can be subjective, predicated on your knowledge of the threat profile. We would physically set on those individuals and watch them while that protectee was in proximity. And, it wasn't foolproof, but at least you had a good eye on that person that if they started to move towards your protectee, you could make proper notifications and so forth. But, the evaluation of those individuals today is something that at times can be overwhelming due to just your social media feeds today. And then the challenge to Pete and Ken, from where I sit, the biggest challenge I hear from not only in the government, but also in the private sector, is just the sentiment analysis, meaning those individuals that you're really just not sure about, but they're out there harboring some sort of grievance, the grievance collectors, the individuals that are out there. Like, you could certainly put the most recent shooter that assassinated the MIT professor and did the school shooting at Brown, perhaps in that bucket, is that kind of grievance collector that's out there and harbors ill will against the university or the professor for whatever reason.
You talked about the grievance collector, and in looking at these different threats and the sources, I really see out there, and I'd like your opinion on it. You have two different things. You have the lone wolf, you have your Oswald, you have the guy at Brown University and MIT, you have the shooting of Charlie Kirk, but then you have these organized groups out there too. And we look at Bondi Beach, which seems to have had a little bit of more organization and penetration by potential third-party actors into that. It seems to me we always will have a difficulty getting that lone wolf unless they are vocal or posting or having some type of social media presence. Are we doing as good a job with that lone wolf as we can? And is the threat from that larger group, let's say the ISIS Bondi Beach actors, or, I even go back and being a student of this and an event I'm sure well too, the attack on Blair House, back then with the Puerto Rican nationalist, great study done of that by Stephen Hunter in his book,
Right.
An American Shootout. Where do you see it going? What can we do better about the lone wolf, or is there a way we can do better and still respect our constitutional rights and people's right to privacy? And is the threat from these third-party inspired group activities gaining more momentum?
Well, I think that's a great question. And, Truman was in residence when they hit the Blair House. And, we studied that and walked through that at the Secret Service Academy and so forth. When you look at, in general, these organized groups, I think the FBI, via their Joint Terrorism Task Forces here in the continental United States, has done a pretty good job at breaking apart organized terror. You can look at this recent roundup in Southern California as an example of that, where you had this loose-knit group of anarchists, domestic terrorists, however you want to define them, that were planning attacks. And the Bureau used undercover agents to go in and infiltrate the group. That's been their model for quite some time. That lone shooter has always haunted us. And I think there's unrealistic expectations upon the public that the FBI is always going to find that air quote Charlie Kirk kind of shooter. I think it's very, very difficult to do. The Secret Service, through some of their major case studies over the years, have looked at these kinds of shooters, like the two women that were the Manson followers that went after President Ford in the 2-week period of time, Sarah Jane Moore and Squeaky Fromm.
Yeah.
And, was that organized? Perhaps, but those lone individuals tend to come out of nowhere at times, kind of like Hinckley, who popped out of the press pool there at the Hilton in the D.C. area off Connecticut Avenue and shot President Reagan. Or you look at Chapman, who shot John Lennon, who had no protection whatsoever. So it's always been my experience, though, Ken. And I've looked at a lot of assassinations and investigated many when I was an agent. And usually you will find evidence of some sort of warnings and indicator after that attack or after that bombing. You had collected it as either part of the digital exhaust or intercepts, wiretaps, whatever, but the analysts had not made sense of it in time in order to do that notification or to put some sort of preventative measures in place. In other occasions, they come out of nowhere. So I think the biggest problem, well, as I look out over the horizon, as far in my professional opinion, the challenge is identifying that next shooter, especially if someone's running underneath the radar. I think the Bureau, the FBI, JTTFs have a pretty good handle on organized terror in the continental United States. And look, before you popped on, I had mentioned to Pete, between 1968 and 1974, there were 130 domestic hijackings inside the United States. Inside the United States. When's the last time we've had a domestic hijacking? And that was on 9/11. So when you look at it in context, I think we're very capable of neutralizing or preventing a specific kind of threat. But that human behavior by that lone threat actor has still been somewhat vexing for law enforcement.
Earlier in that conversation, you talked about the amount of bombings back then too, and we saw that in the review now of Bondi Beach. They attempted to throw some IEDs and use that. Back in the days earlier, in the last century, we had people getting the anarchist cookbook,
right?
Using the anarchist cookbook. And there was a certain ability to track that because you had to physically purchase that book, order that book, or go check it out. Now all that information's available online to anybody, can pull it up, and maybe not always as successful as we see. None of the devices at Bondi Beach apparently detonated, even though they were activated and thrown. And apparently in some of these other more recent ones, there were some ineffective IED type devices planting. Is that changing the landscape, though? And has it changed the landscape, let's say, in the last 20 years, of that easy availability of information on how to construct destructive devices, whereas before we had to go to someplace like the anarchist cookbook and we could track who was getting access to that?
Yeah, that shows both of our ages, Ken. When you bring up the anarchist cookbook, I remember we had that in our counterterrorism office back in the day. And would leaf through that. But no, I think there's in many ways brilliance and simplicity. And what I mean by that is if you look at the driver on Bourbon Street in New Orleans, it's just simply the jihadi that placed the IEDs along Bourbon Street and then got in his car and just drove through a crowd. I mean, those kinds of simplistic operations are extraordinarily difficult, as you know, for law enforcement to prevent. There's so many soft targets. And, look, I was in Atlanta running protective intelligence operations for the Olympics. And we had the Olympic Village locked down. We knew that we had everything kind of self-contained. And then lo and behold, we had the bombing outside of our secure perimeter at Centennial Park. And that's the kind of problem that befuddles law enforcement, because there's so many different soft targets that you could hit. And when that bomb went off that night and I was notified, my first reaction was, well, can we account for all the Olympic athletes, which we were responsible for protecting? And we were able to do that relatively easily. Fortunately, they were in the Olympic Village. But, we were inundated with just like parents and requests, who else may have been hurt and so forth. And we just did not have the technology, the tools, the manpower in those days to be able to rapidly get to the answers. But, I'm always struck by that kind of incident outside of any kind of secure perimeter that you're trying to lock down.
Yeah. I want to make sure we slow down here for a second and point out some of Fred's links here. So here's his website for the protective service stuff. There's another Fred Burton site too that he has as well. I'll put that link up here in a minute. But if you guys are interested in learning more about this, that's a good place to go for everything. His books are behind him too, by the way, so you can see him on his shelf. But there's the book, The Protective Intelligence Advantage Mitigating the Rising Threat to Prominent People. That's the Amazon link right there. By the way, when you click that Amazon link, Break It Down Show gets a little tiny piece of that, so we'll take our couple of pennies. Under Fire is another one of the books that Fred's prolific with these writing things. So everybody, look, you know what I say. It's Christmas time. It's a giving season. Buy a book for a friend. Books are great gifts. Buy two. Buddy read with them, because these are really interesting books that I think you'll find gripping. Fred, I wanted to ask also, as the tools advance, we're all looking for a needle in a haystack, and sometimes I often joke that I'm just going to go to the field of needles and go there. But in your line of work, I don't know that you guys get to do that, right? Like, I can just look for different things that are commonly available. And so a needle in a haystack really becomes a needle in a data center, which is like multi-football fields around. So, and we've become, it seems like we've become more separate than, like, I always say that unity and unity is us all kind of going in the same direction, right? Diversity is the opposite of that. So as we have Discord servers with little subgroups from video games, and our language is evolving at a rapid pace. Like here on YouTube, like, we're compelled to say, I'm gonna unalive somebody, well, that's not terms that we said 25 years ago. So language is changing. People are pocketing into smaller and smaller groups, and off-the-shelf software and parts, you can snipe from 3 miles away and be terrified to somebody. And I'm just saying, sniping. We have a lot of information. We talk about, like, looking at the threat. There's actual people that do that. We talked about on the ground, all these people running around like, I'm exhausted, but also the analysis piece and how do you properly process that across all of these different agencies that may have the piece of information. We talked about, how Navy knew about, well, they know a lot of people, really, but Oswald in this case. How do we process all of that in a way that, again, protects people's rights, but also protects the asset?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's a very unique challenge. I think technology is the solution in many ways. If you hearken back to the agents that were on the Lancer detail with Kennedy, which was the code name for the JFK detail, the agents had what they called flashcards in their pockets, which were 3x5 index cards. And on one side was a picture of a threat actor. On the other side was, their white male name, date of birth, and so forth. Now imagine, as you're on that motorcade around Dealey Plaza, how are you going to remember to look at your flashcard? How are you going to pick out a threat actor and standing along a motorcade route? It's almost impossible. So today, obviously, you have technology solutions. You have facial recognition. You have license plate readers. You have the ability to collect tactical intelligence, almost in an intelligence kind of umbrella or bubble around whatever kind of location you're looking at with a geofence. And you can do monitoring of threat actors, old school surveillance of those that are known, that are in proximity, or a degree of technical surveillance. But, at the end of the day, it's fascinating to me, and I think back of all the different protection schools I've been to, and you were usually just focused on the 3 to 6 foot kill zone, when that individual can pop out like Hinckley did, and you're looking for eyes and hands, and you're looking for the individual that's wearing a heavy coat on a bright, hot day. Those kinds of behavioral kind of characteristics. But then you hearken out now with this sniper threat, and you have to look at, a process of not only counter sniper capabilities, but drones and the management of those, which in itself is a logistical nightmare at times, depending upon the locations and jurisdictions and everything else that's going on, getting permissions and so forth. So, it's kind of a daunting challenge. Especially when you're looking for an unknown threat actor that just might come out of the woodwork So you really got to think about it in context of, very good process and procedures with concentric rings of security, taking into account that threat landscape for your unique principle. And, today it's hard to not find a CEO or a company that hasn't been threatened in some capacity. It's also hard to find a company that is not in some way associated with the industrial war machine, whatever you want to identify that, helping the U.S. government or state and local government in some capacity. So, the evolution to me of the protective intelligence analyst capacity is one that's really kind of taken off like wildfire.
Mm.
I teach this topic from time to time, and, I encourage that bright young person that wants to get into law enforcement in some capacity to think about that as a career if they don't want to carry a gun and, have a badge, that, there's just a proliferation of that both in the public and in the private sector as well.
When we look at the threats again, we're seeing other Charlie Kirk like figures, like Tim Pool, for example, is a political commentator. He's been pretty open about being swatted at his house, having to up his security posture, having to move. These things all take money. Now, look, he makes good money running his shows, but he's having to make hard decisions. And some of this can be political machinations where, like, we're just going to overwhelm these voices with threat so that they no longer want to take on the risk or can't afford the risk, and you haven't necessarily technically maybe broken the law, maybe a RICO statute somewhere here and there, but just that process too of the threat, the business of the threat is so overwhelming for people. It might keep them locked up on their compound as opposed to going out and talking and making their living.
Yeah, there's great, one of the evolutions of technology, which has been phenomenal, is, companies like 360 Privacy, for example, and they eliminate the PII, the personal identification information that's out there on executives or personnel that have been threatened. They try to eliminate your digital exhaust to make it more difficult for a threat actor to try to find that person, that influencer or whatever. But you raise a very good point, Pete. These kinds of influencers today in the aftermath of, the Charlie Kirk assassination is something that, has been a proliferation of protection teams protecting these high profile influencers and so forth and personalities, because there's so many people out there, especially in our fractured continental United States, that's very polarized today, much like the 68 to 72 window when our nation was literally on fire with the same kind of problems.
We've been talking about the threat and some of the things we can do to mitigate that, but I want to shift gears here for just a second. I want to talk about the individuals that are involved in personal protection. And I want to talk about the level of valor that's involved in that. And I'll go back to Major Rathbone standing up after Kennedy's been shot and trying to, interrupt, the assassination, albeit afterwards. I don't remember the agent's name, but the agent on Mrs. Kennedy's detail that leapt forward and threw his body across the top.
Clint Hill recently passed away.
There you go. Yeah. And then I look at, our current director of the Secret Service, who was there in Butler, and his team who reacted, I think, appropriately and placed their bodies between the potential threat or, the neutralized threat at that point and the protectee. Has there been an evolution, or do you see a change in the type of people that are willing to make that sacrifice? Or is this a warrior thread that is, consistent through the ages, that we have to have warriors in place that are willing to do what needs to be done when that moment happens?
Yeah, it's a great point, Ken. You look at the protectors today, and I spend a lot of time talking with them, visiting with them, speaking to them on different topics. And, the protectors today are much like Clint Hill, who was the agent that jumped on the back of the limousine and tried to protect President Kennedy and the First Lady, Jackie Kennedy, at the time. it very much lives today. I mean, I see it every day. A lot of them are, professionals in this business have chosen it as a career. Many have come out of the U.S. military in some capacity. A lot of them have been in various special services, whether it be former Rangers, Navy SEALs, former Green Berets. But then again, a lot of them are former police officers that just want to get into this kind of business. You work for a company and usually the benefits are very good, with pay and stock options and so forth. So, that mentality still exists. These are, for lack of better words, bullet catchers, if it really hits the fan, as we saw in Butler, as we saw at Dealey Plaza, and elsewhere over the course of time. So it's a growing industry. I've seen that over the time I've been in this for the past 25 years in many ways. You're hard pressed to not find a Fortune 1000 company today that doesn't have an executive protection team, a GSOC, a command center, that has residential security programs. Some of them are very sophisticated. A lot of them come out of the alphabet soup agencies and, are a mixture of professionals that have come through the ranks, either former law enforcement, former military, former Secret Service, CIA, State Department, whatever, and have gone into the business. So, the assassination of Brian Thompson, the United Healthcare CEO, was one of those watershed moments in our industry that is the first chapter of my last book that I co-wrote with Scott Stewart. Scott and I were agents together back in the day. And, that really kind of changed the face of protection over the past year. And we're seeing many more teams for the first time get actual board of director input into what is it that you need? Are we doing everything we can? Because at the end of the day, it's a business, and there's a business continuity issue. There's a risk management issue when you start looking at the protection of some of these world leaders that are business people today that you see every day on the Daily Mail or the New York Post or in the BBC.
No, I think that the valor that these people over the years have shown can never be overstated. It takes a special person with a special mindset to do that job correctly. Anybody with the proper background and training may get into that job, but how that person reacts when that first round goes off, is the world of difference. And I think that's where the wheat and the chaff get separated there. I go back to, again, which I just think is a very unsung incident in our history in this protection, being the attack on Blair House when Truman was in residence in Blair House. And those, at that time, Secret Service police officers on the street, that was that first layer of protection, several of which gave their lives. And the Secret Service agents that were inside the Blair House that finally stopped that pretty well organized attack by multiple gunmen at the time. I don't think that they ever got the credit they should have gotten because oftentimes I think the general public and even government institutions consider the fact that the attack even occurred to be a failure. And so the protectors aren't always given the credit that they deserve, that they stepped up in that moment, whether it be Clint Hill reacting when no one else reacted at that time on that, you said the Lancer detail, those people there. It's just an incredible amount. I happened to watch the Hinckley Reagan shooting live. I was a young person. I'd actually been out fishing with my grandfather that morning, and we'd gotten home, and it was up on the television. And I've watched that video over and over again. And what I watch were those agents and those Metropolitan Police officers and how they reacted. And it's something that's stuck with me throughout my career, and always hoped that if I was put in that situation that I would react in the same way that those did. And, thank God I was never in that situation. But that valor, again, I don't think can be understated.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. I was working with the Secret Service when Hinckley shot Reagan, and I spent many nights at George Washington University Hospital, after the shooting, on midnights, standing post, primarily outside of former Press Secretary Brady's office. He was the one that was shot in the head,
Right.
and as a result came out the Brady bill. But and then I can remember, I think it was Sadat we had at the Blair House once, and I was there at the Blair House, and all I could think about was that attack when Truman was there. And you would like to think that you would do the right thing when those kinds of moments happen. But the time, as as you watch that attempt on President Reagan, and the Secret Service agent that took the round in the chest, and his name, I'm blanking on his name now. I believe
I
he's
was
still
going to
alive.
ask you to remind history of who he was. That's the agent that stepped forward and made himself big. Spread his
Exactly.
arms and legs and put his body between the threat and the protectee. I know he retired and went on, I believe, to be a police executive in Illinois or someplace like that afterwards. All that training came together at that point in time, and he did what he was trained to do. He put himself between the protectee and the threat, and he made himself big and caught that bullet.
Yeah, he did. That was one of the tactics that they would teach. Would get big, and then as part of your body cover to evacuate. And I remember Jerry Parr. I think Jerry was in charge of that detail at the time, as the one who pushed Reagan into the back of the limo and drove directly to GW Hospital, which probably saved the president's life by doing that instead of taking him back to the White House. But the police officer's name was Delahanty, if memory serves me right. I believe the Secret Service agent that was shot was Andrew McCarthy.
I think you're right.
But please don't quote me on that. Someone would have to fact check that. But and then former Press Secretary Brady was shot. His wife, they're both deceased now, but his wife was a wonderful lady that was by her husband's side at GW there a lot. But the Secret Service, it's really a very interesting organization, which I have the utmost respect for. Is that the organization has a zero fail mission, literally zero fail. And history has not been kind to them. But when a tragic event occurs, they do a good job of fixing those problems and moving forward, trying to stay one step ahead of that innovative threat actor or that nation state actor that's trying to do whatever it is they have that are, threats against the president or vice president or visiting heads of state. And it's a difficult job, and protection 24/7 is a tough duty. I mean, I can remember many nights standing at the vice president's residence, and this would have been Vice President Bush during Reagan's first term. It's 2:00 in the morning, it's cold, there's nothing moving except raccoons. And you hope that one of them doesn't sneak up on you. And it's a very tough job, and people don't realize how tough it is. And then you throw that travel schedule in play. We're always just hopscotching around the country or the globe. You're never home.
Right.
It's just difficult duty.
We talked about a lot of terrifying things. What about the regular people? The not Charlie Kirks, the folks that just go to work and everything else. It's easy to get terrified of the big world out there because it is dangerous. What are your thoughts on just regular, everyday, day-to-day folks that are never going to have a detail to protect them, never going to have analysts advising and helping protect them? What do you have to say to them?
Well, I think it's a good question. I think that it boils down to a lot of personal responsibility and situational awareness. You have to take care of your own self, especially in this day and age with reduced law enforcement resources, growing response times. God forbid you're hurt, you literally could bleed out before, in many ways, uniform patrol can get to you in a certain period of time. I think you got to take a lot of personal responsibility for your own safekeeping. I mean, I live down here in Texas, and pretty much everybody I know has a concealed handgun permit in some capacity, and they're looking out for themselves and their family, and so forth. So I think that you have to be situationally aware when you go out to these public events, and recognize that, think about how you would get yourself out of whether it be a movie theater or a parade event of some sort. Think about what you would do. And it doesn't take a lot to run through that in your mind. How are you going to get out of that hotel? How are you going to get out of this parade route? What's my plan if I'm at a school and one of these events unfold? What am I going to do? I think a good number of people, and again, I don't know if this is probably psychologically better for most of them, but I think most people don't think of bad things that could unfold in real time. And maybe it's just us because of our background and training that we're thinking of these kinds of things. But I preach that a lot when I talk to different groups and organizations, that think about taking care of yourself and have some degree of pre-plan. Look, there's simple things you can do too. Most high-profile protective details on private personnel, they carry smoke hoods with them, and they bring those smoke hoods to locations like hotels, especially if you're traveling abroad. And it's a hood that goes over your head in the event of a fire. You could put one on in the event of you're riding a subway and there's some sort of disturbance or attack on the subway, to get yourself out of that kind of problem. Some of the basics, if you can, carry a knife, carry mace, carry a flashlight. Think about your public transportation. What would you do in the event of? Choose your seats today. We've seen some of these horrific attacks on public transportation. Make sure you stay situational aware and choose your seat so you can keep an eye on people and hopefully not have anybody behind you if you can. So, those are the kinds of personal choices that people have to make on their own to try to just safeguard themselves.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and it's amazing the amount of first aid equipment I have in my truck now than what I used to have back in the day. I never would have thought to carry a combat tourniquet with me.
Right.
I was a young law enforcement officer, and when I was an agent, those kinds of things weren't as popular or available. But now I have a backpack in the truck that contains a lot of that kind of stuff. I keep seeing the hat behind you in your diplomatic security service, and I think a lot of people don't know about DSS and their role. It's one of the big unsung federal agencies, but it's an agency that's played some critical roles even in the post 9/11 era. And some of the captures and repatriations of terrorists involved in the planning and execution of that. Give us a quick overview of, where's DSS today? Where are they going? What missions are they expanding into? Again, a very unsung agency that plays a critical role in protecting America, both overseas and within the United States.
I appreciate that shout out for the organization, which I'm very proud to have once been a part of. It goes back to 1916 when it was the Bureau of Secret Intelligence. And it's grown over the years, and it's mostly changed and shifted due to horrific events, whether it be the bombings of the embassies in Beirut, which were some of my cases that I worked on, the kidnappings of diplomats, the hijackings that took place. It's been forged by tragedy and shifted and changed because of it. But, every U.S. embassy and consulate in the world has special agents of the Diplomatic Security Service. They have site security managers. They have protection teams that manage the protection of the U.S. ambassadors. They have a counterintelligence team that works on nation-state hostile threats against the U.S. Embassy and U.S. Embassy personnel. They are risk management specialists and experts. A lot have retired out or quit and joined the private sector. I'm always running into them at pretty much every major multinational corporation in the world. They have a tough job, as evidenced by what unfolded in Benghazi. There were 5 young special agents there responsible for protecting Ambassador Stevens there. They also are involved in fugitive renditions. I've gotten way more credit than I deserve for this, but I was involved with the capture of the first World Trade Center bomber in Pakistan, Ramzi Yousef. But our agents captured him. And today they're doing a tremendous amount of work in the cyberspace, the technical countermeasure space, whether it be combating the Havana syndrome, the microwave attacks against our diplomats and personnel around. It's a tough job. You got to want to live, and you're going to do a lot of protection. Inside the United States, they'll be protecting all the Olympic athletes, all the U.S. Olympic team that will be in Los Angeles. They have historically done that. They do the protection of the foreign minister that visit the United States or at the United Nations General Assemblies every year, the Middle East Peace Conferences. They also do passport and visa fraud. It's very difficult today to counterfeit a U.S. passport, but they're the primary lead agency to look into that. So
I think one thing people may not realize is DSS may be the only U.S. law enforcement personnel or agency someplace in the world. And you talk about being in Pakistan, being part of the Yousef rendition and those types of things. It's something I think Pete and I have experienced also, is because sometimes the Army counterintelligence agent may be the only U.S. law enforcement officer or agent personnel in an area of the world. But you can almost guarantee that every place in the world, at least every country, there's going to be a DSS agent, and they may take on that load of representing the other U.S. law enforcement agencies at that point in time. And I know in my career, in the interactions I had with them, they were a great help, and also absolute true professionals every time I worked with them. So thank you for your service there and your fellow DSS agents over the years. What a great organization.
It is an organization. If you want to see the world at the taxpayer's expense, it's one that you should think about. But be careful what you wish for, because you're going to spend a lot of time setting in follow cars. You're going to be a lot of time on airplanes. But they have a cool organization too, which are the diplomatic couriers. And back in my day, those folks used to make a lot of overtime by just carrying those orange diplomatic pouches around the world. So it's one that you can think about for a career.
Great. Hey, Fred, we're going to wrap it up. Appreciate you coming on. Happy holidays and all of that. I'll run the links underneath everybody, underneath Fred's face here as we wrap these things up. I guess I'll go Ken over here. Ken, anything in closing, and then we'll give Fred the mic.
No, Fred, it was a great opportunity to meet you. I look forward to reading the rest of your books and getting introduced to it. As I've said on previous shows, Pete has done more to expand my library by his guests he brings on than just anybody else in the last 10 years. So I look forward to that. Again, a heartfelt thanks for your service and on behalf of the nation. Many of the things that you did in your career may never be known, and the effect you had rippled out greatly. So thank you for your service, and Merry Christmas.
You're very kind. Well, Pete, Ken, thank you. And I push back and say thank you guys for what you do, what you have done, and what you continue to do. And Merry Christmas. And if there's ever anything I can do to help you too, please give me a shout.
All right, everybody. We'll see you tomorrow with another show. Fred, thank you very much. We'll say goodbye to you in a second off mic. Ken, hang in there for a second. The rest of you, we'll see y'all tomorrow.